Welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is Impact of Digital Influence on Africa's Elections, Lessons from Kenya. Your moderator today is Ferial Hafaji, South African Information, Misinformation and Disinformation Editor. For our online audience, please keep your microphones muted and your cameras turned off during the event. Should you have any questions, kindly use the chat function on your Zoom application. The questions and comments will be sent to the moderator during today's event. To access the chat function, kindly scroll to the bottom of your Zoom application, click on the chat button and a chat box will appear. We will evaluate this event for our online audience using an evaluation poll. The evaluation is completely anonymous and it helps us to present better events in future. Kindly do take a moment to complete it. It will be launched following the presentations portion for today's event. Please note that since this is a public event being broadcast live on YouTube, Chatham House rule does not apply. You may be quoted without your express permission. As we wait for our final participants to connect their audios, we kindly remind you to please keep your microphones muted and your cameras turned off until we reach the Q&A portion for today's event. This event is based on the East Africa Report, A Question of Influence, Case Study of Kenyan Elections in a Digital Age by Karen Allen, Jean Leroux and Boniface Betty, which is available on the ISS website. The link to the report will be shared during the event via the chat function. This is Impact of Digital Influence on Africa's Elections, Lessons from Kenya. Ferial, you have the floor.
Good morning to our friends in the room and to our friends and colleagues joining us online. This is going to be a very important discussion. For me, more important than whether the ANC will maintain its majority in the 2024 election. More important than the stories of coalition building that have occupied our political discussion over the past weeks. It is about the role of influence in elections. And what I truly loved about the study by our three colleagues who I'll introduce in a moment is that not only have they identified a new frontier in determining how our elections turn out, but they've done so by using a comparative country, Kenya, to help us begin to look at what might happen in South Africa next year. So with me on the panel today is Senior Consultant and Lead Author of the research study, Karen Allen. Very welcome. Thank you for having us all here. Alan Chiboy from Kenya and Code for Africa, who has done truly excellent work in helping us understand the Kenyan election. And then South Africa's foremost researcher on disinformation for many years now, Jean Leroux, who wears many hats, you could tell us about. And I very much look forward to this discussion and to bringing you in with questions after we just go through this report a little bit. So Karen, perhaps you can kick us off. What are the key findings in the report which you found interesting, but that also holds lessons not only for South Africa, but across our continent more broadly?
Thanks, Vera. Well, we decided to look at Kenya as you described, as a good comparison for South Africa, but it was a Kenya study in its own right. There are about 11 million people who use social media platforms in Kenya. We were looking at Twitter and we were looking at Facebook as the two major sites. It's not the only one. We know that WhatsApp gets used a lot. TikTok also gets used. But in terms of what's researchable, these are the key platforms. So we looked at some 8 million documents during a highly contested time. We won't go into the details about the political context other than to say it was a highly contested race between William Ruto, subsequently became president, and Raila Odinga, a very, very familiar face on the Kenyan scene. And it was very interesting because through a mixture of data analytics, open source investigative techniques, and literally old-fashioned journalism, field interviews, face-to-face interviews, we were able to get a picture of the information ecosystem during the election time in Kenya. And it was really important because one of the interviewees that we managed to speak to said, we knew from the beginning this election would be fought on the basis of tech. we knew that this was going to be a game changer. And as you know, Kenya is a very, very energetic online environment. People use a lot of social media platforms, and there's a great hunger for news and for information. So what did our report find? Well, one of the key findings that we were able to come up with was we saw this concept of the commoditization of influence as a service, influence as a commodity. And one of the things, as Jean, who did the research with me, and I found, was that people who were largely spending their time as product influencers, who might be pushing everything from plimsolls to makeup, and had huge followings and huge influence, pivoted to politics during the time of that election. And they lent their influence through a variety of different engagement techniques to be able to either bring existing followers with them or to generate new narratives and new followers for the assistance of certain political players. I have to use the word political actors because I'm talking in NGO land, but I still call them political players. Actors belong on the stage. So what we saw was that this concept of influence as a service, the ability to basically use your networks to be able to amplify certain narratives. That doesn't mean that there weren't political influencers whose primary motivation would appear to be political or ideological. But this thing that really stood out for us was the idea of product influencers. So we saw in Kenya the idea of commodification of influence, influence of the service, highly entrepreneurial in many respects, also highly sinister if one wants to look at the other side of it. And because we looked at it through a political lens, through the context of an election, we saw the various narratives that were used to effectively stir the pot, to whip up tensions or endeavor to whip up tensions, and to sow certain elements of disinformation, but primarily to build a body of people online that could be fed certain messages also the campaign season. And one has to ask that if we saw this happening in an election environment, we could also see those same techniques being used by other players, for example, transnational criminal groups, for example, terrorist groups, drug gangs. Anyone who really wants to be able to create influence and be able to undermine the pillars of democracy, which include legacy media, that these might be techniques that they may also be able to adopt. We also saw that the legacy media in Kenya, and it's a very different media environment to South Africa, and I'm sure we'll talk about that during the course of the discussion, really struggled to be able to keep up and really struggled to be able to provide either counter narratives, provide context, or be able to rebut certain untruths that were online.
Is that because they're so partisan?
There's a perception that they are partisan. There is a perception that a lot of the advertising revenue, which of course was so important to the political parties at the time, that they were skewed towards one side. So it was seen during, and it was endorsed in interviews that we did, that Raila Odinga's side, the Azimio team, if you like, he was supported by the previous president, Uhuru Kenyatta. They had access to the media, and therefore they could position their advertising there. For William Ruto's team, they felt that they were unable to gain access to advertising spaces, and so they had to resort to some quite novel tactics to be able to get their message out. And we'll talk a bit later about the Hustler Nation Intelligence Bureau and the deep state narrative. And that was one of their tactics, and they described it to us as a tactic to be able to get their responses out. I think the other finding that really came out was where speed is king, particularly with the possibility of AI tools coming. And we did this study before ChatGPT became a thing, and before we saw the use of avatars, for example, in political campaigning. But within the context of rapidly evolving AI, again, the case studies that we spoke to were very, very clear that they were already honing those skills. What that means is communicators, whether they're journalists, or whether they're government communicators, are going to have to get smarter, and they're going to have to get faster, that no comment is no longer an option. They're going to have to get better at being able to provide context, understand some of the disinformation narratives that are coming through, understand not only just disinformation, but also influence, because it's a wider spectrum than simply putting something on which looks a bit fake and pretending that Barack Obama had supported one particular candidate, which was one of the fake stories that we saw. So, we talk about this potential for an automated arms race in influence operations during elections. And I think, one of the warnings for countries like South Africa is that given the fact that there are new tools that are coming on stream, and between now and when we go to the polls at some point in 2024, there will be a whole plethora of other technical tools which help to amplify influence, is that the media and communicators need to get a heck of a lot smarter and a heck of a lot faster in terms of how they respond. One thing, just a final observation, one of the things, the good news about the Kenyan election was that before the election, there was an incredible amount of work that was done by NGOs and by fact-checking organizations and organizations like Code of Africa to try and, again, I'm going to use a horrible NGO word, sensitize the media, but make people aware in media houses, make people aware in certain aspects of civil society about the potential for disinformation, about the potential for influence operation. And as a consequence, and you'll see the examples in the report, there were certain clear disinformation narratives which were stamped as fake news before they got out too far. And that's a huge tribute to the heavy lifting that was done before the election to try and minimize the effect of these influences.
Very good, that digital army of the good. So Alan, was this Kenya's first social media election? Where for the first time, social media much more powerful than the old methods of covering an election, if you to consider it from a journalist point of view?
I think when it comes to the context of Kenya, the reason Karen actually mentioned about, for this time round, everyone was aware about the potential of tech and social media playing a huge role in terms of controlling conversations about the elections, is because in the previous election, there were allegations of Cambridge Analytica having been involved in amplifying content, promoting different political actors in the country. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of critical voices to look at it from, or probably analytical institutions like the work that was done this time around. So it kind of created an environment where people, tried, and even the influencers who were part of amplifying the narratives on social media started seeing an opportunity. Is there, if a foreign company can, be involved in an election and earn lots of money from it, then why is it that they can't do it as a homegrown, industry? And I think that's what contributed to that vibrant community that we witnessed in this particular election. I would say social media played a very huge role. Everyone was on Twitter, everyone was on Facebook every single day to get information about elections. And I would say, yes, this is one of the elections that social media played a very huge role in. Yeah.
Do you think it had a role in the final outcome? Because it was a tightly run election until there was a runoff as well. So do you think social media was influential in the outcome?
I would say it is, because traditionally, when it comes to the Kenyan space, the media used to play a very huge role in terms of, the narratives and controlling what really results in political conversations across the information sphere. This time around, with the allegations about one side of the political divide not having access to the media, then there had to be an industry being created where social media then becomes a go-to place. Everyone becomes a reporter, essentially. And then that, created a lot of trust issues when it comes to the media. And everyone then started looking at social media as the source of truth, which then I think played a very huge role when it comes to this election.
Thank you. We'll come back to some more of your findings. So I know, Jean, from the height of the state capture area, where we were seeing these armies on Twitter and had absolutely no idea where they came from, how it arose. And what were you doing at the time? I forget you were.
I was actually at the Financial Services Board at that stage.
And it was just like amateur sleuthing and helping us identify the roots of where that what turned out to be the Pottages army came from. And you've gone on since then to make this your life.
Yeah, by and large.
by and large.
Whether it's a good or a bad thing is still up there, but
But so Cambridge Analytica, Bell Pottinger, they're the first big times we see these. Do you think we now have a cottage industry of mini Bell Pottingers and Cambridge Analyticas across our continent? Because I know you're more than just Kenya and South Africa.
yeah, I mean, it's one of the interesting things that came out from the study was exactly that fact. I mean, you used to seeing the Bell Pottingers and the Cambridge Analyticas, the big
Global
PR firms.
multinationals.
They're the ones doing this. They're the ones hiding back in the shadows, doing PR management, setting up these avenues for distributing whatever narratives their clients want to get out there. And what was interesting about this particular study was the way that that's been almost, democratized. So it's no longer the big PR firms, it's now smaller individuals, small organizations in country that are actually doing this. They've, the tools are available. You don't need to be a PR specialist to be able to do this. If you understand the information environment you're working in, it's a lot easier for you to build up and craft those narratives.
So anybody can be
Anybody can basically do that, and that's it's the beauty of it as well. But it's also a double-edged sword because it allows the good message to get out there. People who don't have a voice normally can use social media to get their expressions out there. But it also allows for bad actors to step in and use those same tools, those same platforms for their own nefarious ends. And they're often in a better strategically positioned. They are a lot more focused on the direction and the narratives they'd like to get out. And that also makes it a bit more dangerous to get them on board as opposed to the good guys.
This is a question for any of you. So in the case studies you've chosen to look at, I wasn't clear whether this was digital arbitrage, that they were being paid for their work, or whether they were doing it to line up a job when the person becomes president, or whether they were doing it out of political conviction.
Interesting. I mean, just to answer that and to just add on to one point, just to amplify what these guys were saying, we're talking about homegrown influence, and that's really important. That these are Kenyan actors by and large. And the case studies that we looked at a range of different motivations, and we specifically chose sort of one from each group, if you like. One of our first case study is a highly influential, both online and offline individual. Pretty well known. We actually see fit to name it because actually it's his the way he operates, which is interesting, not him as an individual.
I was dying to know.
Yeah, no, but I think a lot of people working in the Kenyan political space know exactly who this is. But he was motivated largely by ideology, but he was a disgruntled apparatchik previously who'd worked with William Ruto, and he moved with him when Ruto was the vice president to Uhuru Kenyatta, and he is a digital marketeer, incredibly bright, intelligent guy, but who by and large was sort of positioned as an influence actor who was doing it largely for ideological purposes. I don't believe for 1 minute that he wasn't being paid a huge vast amount of money to be able to do that. But he presented himself largely as an ideological actor. 61% of the material that he generated was all self-generated tweets. So he was there to try and shape narratives and to be able to carve the direction of travel. Another influencer that we looked at, our second case study, was the opposite. He's one of these product influencers. He's motivated by financial gain. And just to give you an idea, because we were talking to him about the market for influence. I mean, the kinds of money that we're talking about is, you could generate a hashtag and it can cost anything from $770 through to about 70,000 euros.
So this is big money.
Huge money. The daily rate for disinformation tweets, something like $500 there. I mean, an extraordinary amount of money is going with this. And he was very, very clear. Although he had also been politically trained, he was effectively a commercial operator. He'd been plucked by politicians to come work for them during the course of the election campaign 6 months before. He had an army of students who worked with him, who were paid to basically push out, amplify messages. And he was very, very clear. He would work for whoever paid the highest price. He claimed that he'd been participating in other African elections in the past. He also claimed that in this particular election, he'd been approached by other external actors, but hadn't decided to work for them.
So in countries with high youth unemployment, you have a ready market.
Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
right.
And maybe just to kind of add a little bit on that, where I saw there is a lot of financial incentive that was kind of invested into political campaigning and, specifically controlling the narratives online is during our monitoring, as much as, a lot of it happened on Twitter and on Facebook, there was almost an element of, WhatsApp creating an environment where, closed spaces, people can have conversations, out of the light, no one can actually know what's happening. And just to give an example, during the elections, there were region-specific WhatsApp groups that were created by both political divides. And these WhatsApp groups were being used specifically for political campaigning, calling on people to come to rallies, calling on people to do X, Y, Z. But then it morphed into a closed space where many people then were looking at conversations of, hate against each other. There was a lot of conflict within these groups. A lot of the people within the groups were young people. And then there was kind of dissemination of messaging from like top-down levels. So like it's kind of messaging being crafted by the higher ups and then disseminated into the different WhatsApp groups. And what that tells you is that there is resources invested in it, because I wouldn't probably personally be just there to do all this, out of probably an ideological perspective, right? And WhatsApp is really hard to manage because they are regional, there are so many, and there needs to be time invested. There needs to be messaging, crafting of messaging that will resonate well with the audience. And I think, yeah, there was a lot of investment. And as you said, the youth played a key role. University students, a lot of it were primarily university students who, are looking for that extra dollar to spend on food. And probably, when they are told you can get $10 a day for you to help in amplifying messaging, then that becomes.
And how did they recruit this? The people who ran the influence office?
So a lot of it was through political strategists. So what we could tell. Of course, you can't do kind of an analysis on a platform like WhatsApp. It was based on what we were part of as analysts, some of us, and then just looking at some of the trends that we're looking at. You could tell that it was more, through political strategists. We're not able to talk to most of them, but I think the recruitment basically happened either on through WhatsApp itself, and then also connected networks of people who also been involved in the space for a long time.
Network.
Yeah.
And then how do you keep the public square, how do you keep it clean, like politically democratic and open and transparent, when you have these influence ops moving very quickly off the mediums which can be analyzed into closed groups?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of difficult because you don't want to suppress free speech. It's always this very fine line that you're walking between, enabling and allowing free speech and then clamping down on the bad speech. When I'm saying bad speech, it's not about what's being said, it's about how they're saying it. Having, paid influencers who are not clear and disclosing that they're being paid, or having sock puppet accounts who, are actually based in a different country, but they're pretending to be South Africans, for example, amplifying these narratives. That is an issue. And that inauthenticity of the messaging is an issue, not the actual content that's being said. Closed platforms like WhatsApp, like Telegram, makes it a lot more difficult because, and it's kind of the same issue that we've got with Twitter now at the moment. When we did this report, the Twitter API was still open and accessible. You still had access to that data directly from the platforms. Whereas with closed platforms like WhatsApp, Telegram, and Signal, you don't have that same wide programmatic level of access where you can get all of the data, map out the interaction. So you're almost more limited to looking at, as I said, like individual regional groups. You kind of need to, I don't want to use the word infiltrate, but you need to have access to those groups. You need to join them. You need to basically sit there and watch and see what's being said. And it's, it's very difficult to keep an eye on them and seeing where there's coordination because you don't have that same kind of wide scale level of access as you would have on social and public platforms.
And
It doesn't make it, so sorry, just to get in quickly,
okay.
it doesn't make it less of an influential avenue. Usually with things like WhatsApp groups and even Facebook groups to a lesser extent, because it's so much more small and intimate, it's to the people that stay around you, it's the people that work with you or the people that share your hobbies and interests. It does make the messages that come through there a bit more believable. You're more likely to,
Absolutely.
listen to somebody that you work with, if they're setting something on a group, then if
My
it's some
neighbor
random-
WhatsApp groups are like.
Exactly. Neighborhood WhatsApp
Yeah.
groups are a very good example of where, both good and bad information comes through relatively.
And how big is the the political influencer economy, would you say? Can we begin to put money on it?
Just in terms of the value.
Yeah.
It's very difficult because I think it depends at a particular time, even at the point of the campaign. So, as you get close to election day, obviously the stakes are higher, the figure goes up. Kenya's an incredibly entrepreneurial environment. And so, there'll be a lot of hustling to be able to get this price. So I think it's very difficult to put a price on because it's a moving target. But I would say that it's certainly, I don't know if you agree, Alan, but I think it's very much, is it replicable elsewhere? Yes, I think it is. I think what's always been very striking is there is a very, very strong can-do mentality in Kenya in terms of if there is an avenue to be able to make some money. This is incredibly entrepreneurial. If we look at it in a completely neutral way, it's what people are doing is incredibly entrepreneurial. I think the worry is whether that then gets instrumentalized by bad actors to be able to cause harm. But I think it's very difficult to put a price on it. There might be, I don't know, you used to work for a management consultancy. Would you be able to put a price together on this?
Like, I know the influencer economy in South Africa is growing. I don't know about the political influence market, but the influencer economy is probably getting bigger than many other kinds of marketing. So I'm just trying to wonder if we can begin to do that. But Alan, what I wanted to ask you is, what would you see as the key lessons for South Africa from the research that you did?
I think maybe just to, and probably just to also add on the previous point
Yes.
before coming into the lessons learned for South Africa is, in terms of the value, you can't put a price on the value, but we, as Code for Africa, we were under a consortia that were also looking at the Kenyan elections. And the responsibility was to build early warning detection systems for hate speech and disinformation and influence, but then also the response bit. One of the things that we tried to implement was basically using influencers as a force for good. And, the media as a force for good when it comes to this conversation, and also primarily using youth ambassadors. So we worked with 2 local organizations in Kenya. One of them was kind of a leading organization that does kind of youth ambassador and network kind of dissemination of information. It's called Shujaz. They're really good with building products that can then resonate well with the youth. And they had 1 million youth ambassadors in Kenya.
So you have this wave of influencer ops and then this other wave to counter.
And the reason I said so, the detection informed the strategies for what eventually we created as the response. Now, my point to this is that when we were looking for the influencers who would eventually be a force for good, it was a little bit harder to get because the lucrative part is not with
so
us, right? It's with the influence, right? So you could see that the value for actually doing the disinformation and influence is a little bit higher than actually helping in, protecting the democracy itself. So I would say it was really lucrative, even though, we couldn't rise about.
And finally, Jean, before we go to our questions, because they're flowing in quite a bit here, is what I love about the report is it gives us a literacy to understand these operations. So astroturfing and doxing, and so run us through some of that. Because you're the first person to tell me these words. It's not puppets. No idea.
Yeah, I remember when we look at these things, this was even before. South Africa's got a dubious distinction of being involved and dragged into an influence campaign even before the US elections in 2016, kind of thrust disinformation and election interference into the limelight. So I think that's a fortunate thing for South Africa. We're very sensitized to online campaigns and bots, and it takes you a couple of seconds online to find one South African calling somebody they disagree with a bot on social media. So we're almost oversensitive when it comes to that. But we actually, in this report, we actually looked at some of those constructs, because these are things that influence actors use to coerce and to manipulate conversations online. And there are things like astroturfing and sock puppets, where they use accounts that pretend to be someone or something they're not. A good example locally was the crypto bots, individuals sitting in India, crafting narratives and targeting journalists based in South Africa, pretending to be South Africans. And then the way that they do this and the ultimate goal of a lot of these actions is to get other users exposed to it. So they've got their own closed network of people, the ones who are being paid, who are in on the game. And they're actually trying to get that narrative outside of that. They want to make sure that you and I and the people who just kind of are randomly scrolling down their social media feed are coming across those same narratives, because that's what they want to influence. They don't want to influence themselves because they're already bought in. And they do this often by tricking the algorithms of the platforms. If you can have a small amount of high volume posters, people who are posting 200, 300, 400 times a day using a particular hashtag, a particular phrase, that tricks the algorithms on these platforms to say, well, this is something that's interesting. People are talking about this. We need to bump this up on people's feeds. And very quickly, you then start seeing
propaganda.
It is, yeah. And the thing is, it's because you're used to your timeline being curated. When you see these things, it's very, very personalized. It's very you don't think twice when you see it on your feed because you're so used to being presented stuff that you are engaged with, that you like to see. So it's, having influencers involved in that, for me, this is probably one of the interesting things and the most applicable thing for South Africa from the study is this commoditization of influence, having people who are willing for the highest bidder to say anything in order to, get a message out there and to be
really, huge celebrities, the likes of musicians. And I think those are the people who are involved more in campaigning, and it wouldn't be trying to skew using, astroturfing and type of inauthentic means. It will more be about campaigning, which is okay. What we were seeing here is people who are kind of in the shadows, and they are very small networks, very intimate, and even just knowing who they are, it had to take, a lot of the data analysis that we did, but also trying to also talk to them was very hard because all these accounts are like fake accounts on Twitter. Some of them are, sock puppet accounts. So they were smaller networks, smaller influencers who would kind of try to gain following before the elections or during that particular process as compared to these, huge influencers, except for a few.
Thank you.
Can I just mention, just building on something that Sean was saying, is that this, idea of building up, using all the different terminology. And by the way, anyone who doesn't know what the terminology is really, really helpful in the report. We sat down and had a masterclass on this, and it is incredibly helpful. But one of the case studies in particular was particularly clever at gaming the algorithm, because what he did, he massively upped his engagement by having full-on spats with the media online. And so by using their hashtags and by having an altercation and trying to undermine the media, he actually amplified his reach. And it was quite interesting. So when we did the data analytics, we were thinking, well, why are these two groups aligned? The reason why they're aligned is he deliberately was able to effectively as I say, bump up his presence.
He was courting that engagement.
Exactly. He was courting the engagement and he was goading them on. And this is a former journalist who's effectively switched sides, if you like. But I think that's where journalists need to be quite aware that they could become, the term that gets used as useful idiots, which as a journalist, I found this incredibly offensive. But apparently it's okay to use this phrase within data analysis.
They call us useful idiots
Because we're inadvertently amplifying, and we're foot soldiers. We're basically helping to amplify.
That's it. I feel like I've experienced that. Okay, let's take questions. I have quite a few online. Correct.
Yeah, I have a question. Those ANC, just a remark as well, those ANC influencers, I think they often got paid in kind, like, come to the party, get free, but maybe it's become more sophisticated now. When initially I thought maybe it was just like access, free access. But I have a question about the Kenyan elections and the influence. Yeah, I mean, the influencers, Bonnie Mwangi was, I think, the previous election, not this one, the one before that. He was quite a big name on Twitter, and he sort of made his name on Twitter, and well, that's how a lot of reporters outside of Kenya knew him. Yet he couldn't even win his constituency. And I found it interesting because, I mean, he had such a huge following and presence on Twitter, but he can. So for me, it's interesting how do negative. I mean, how big is the influence of negative campaigns? Do we not overestimate it on Twitter? If a candidate couldn't even win his constituency. So I'm just wondering, and also another thing, who are these tweets aimed at? I mean, in South Africa, we don't have big growing smartphone penetration, but yeah, who are tweets, for instance, or WhatsApps aimed at when there is a disinformation campaign?
That's great.
That's an
We
excellent question.
We also think about manifest one year, because in the data analytics, so what we did initially in the study is to look at all the key influencers. And you're right, he's a big name. He didn't come out as one of the top guys. So in terms of absolute volumes of activity online, although he was a big voice, he didn't actually score very, very highly. And I don't know if you found that also in some of your research.
Yeah.
But he was struggling. He's more of a presence, a physical presence. He's got a long history in Kenyan politics, and he sort of switched from civil society to being a politician and trying to influence sort of in the real world. I think it's difficult. I mean, in terms of Amy, it has to be younger people.
I would actually say, social media plays one role in elections. There is a lot of kind of different other factors. Ethnicity plays a very huge role when it comes to, the politics in Kenya. So I think, and he's not only the only example. We had, comedians who have very huge following or vying during elections, and different other influencers that tried to vie during elections and lost. But I would say for that, there is kind of a mishmash of, the political side that you're playing in, but also social media then becomes an accelerator. So I think probably for this case, it was one or the other. Yeah.
Jean, do we overstate the risk, given that most people don't have smartphones? Although it's interesting to me that most commonly owned asset in South Africa now is a smartphone, and most people have 2 or 3 SIM cards. So it's probably a little more popular than I thought before.
Yeah, I think maybe just to quickly tag on to Alan's point. I mean, I think that's exactly it. I mean, social media and the role you have there is almost like an amplifier, like a multiplier for your original message. If your political message is bad, you're not going to get votes, regardless of how big the social media following is at the end of the day. So it's part of a range of factors. And just merely having a social media following and being big on social media doesn't immediately equate to being a good and successful politician as well. In terms of, I think this just going to combine the 2 questions about that, whether we're overstating the influence of social media, especially in South Africa. I don't think we do. Even though Twitter is a very small platform, for example, but the people you're reaching there are journalists, you're reaching politicians, you're reaching people in positions of influence and people in decision-making positions. So it's not as much in terms of the volume of influence that you can exert there, but the quality of that influence. And all you need is, one journalist, and I'm probably going to point them out because I used to work with them. But Newspaper was a good example of that. During the pandemic, they took a tweet on social media, they ran with it, and they actually had to publish a retraction and an apology afterwards because they didn't check and vet the source. But that was something posted on Twitter. The journalist picked it up, they published it, and that actually then became news, as it were. And that's kind of where the influence and the kind of the sweet spot for people trying to leverage influence on Twitter is finding the journalists, finding the politicians, the so-called useful idiots that'll actually broadcast that message to a wide audience for you.
One of the, when Jean were also presenting this in the UK quite recently, and one of the questions we got asked is, has anyone done any study about the crossover between, for example, local radio, community radio, and online influence? Because you have this toing and froing of information. We see that in South Africa all the time. But given particularly, large numbers of people in Kenya still live in rural areas, that actually, what would have been the interplay between messages that maybe originated online and then ended up. But we're all hungry for content, and that's another thing. There is this hunger. The news environment, which is 24/7, this provides the content.
Absolutely. Twitter and Facebook said yes, please.
So I hear it's a very lucrative business. What's your view? Where does the money come from? Who pays for this? Are there countries, corporations, third parties?
Please, great question.
Where does it come from?
I'm maybe to take this one. Obviously we can't see who it is. If we had that, then there'd be much bigger headlines. Everybody else would know about it as well if we knew exactly who's paying it. But I think that's also the risk. You don't know who's paying for it. If you've got a information economy that's kind of so geared towards doing the bidding of the highest bidder, you run that risk of having anyone step into, whether it's a local politician that's trying to gain support, whether it's a foreign state actor that's stepping into to try and sway elections one way or another, whether it's a multinational company that's trying to and focused on economic policy changes, and they like specific politicians to get in there. There's a multitude of actors who would be willing to pay to get their views and their narratives amplified on social media. That's the big risk of this. So if you've got an economy that's almost vulnerable in that sense, that anyone can step in as long as their pockets are deep enough, you run that risk of not knowing who's spreading these messages on your social platforms.
I do want to spend a few moments talking about Russia, but first to get through a number of comments and questions here. From Stanley Kiptanui, is it social media which played the key role or tribal dynamics? You touched on that. From Overwatch 1, a big challenge in Kenya was the lack of social media oversight when posts were in local languages, that is non-English. Same for Ethiopia. South Africa has 11 official languages. How many moderators can cover all languages is essential. From Rolf Pretorius, did the Kenyan government do anything to expose disinformation? And if so, what was done? There's more here, but perhaps we could start with that. Alan?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the language issue because it was quite a huge issue, because even for us, one of the main components we were looking at was hate speech. And a lot of the hate speech in Kenya was actually in vernacular. It's not really in English or in Swahili. And social media platforms will essentially, not be able to pick up content that is in localized languages. And what we did initially was actually start compiling what we call a lexicon of hate speech keywords with context, especially because, and I'll give an example that I've given quite a number of times, which is during the elections, the term madoadoa in Kenya actually is very divisive. It's a word that essentially means dots on a map, but from a Kenyan context, it was kind of when a politician mentions that particular word, it means we need these ethnic groups to be removed from this particular region. So it's kind of, when it's used in a context of Kenya, you'd actually consider it to be hate speech. But in Tanzania, they speak Swahili. It's a Swahili word, and anyone can use madoadoa because it's any other Swahili word. So with that context, then social media platforms would really struggle because you need that context for you to actually identify such term. And that also plays a role.
So you established a dictionary.
Yeah, so it's more or less like a dictionary. And it's kind of a growing dictionary because as part of the response that we are doing, one of the other things we are doing is surveys, just asking, the youth, which word do you feel is offensive when someone mentions it, about you, and collecting that data, consolidating it, using linguists to help us, validate that. So it takes time, but I think building that knowledge base is kind of the power of solving this challenge.
That's a good way that we could also work in South Africa. A couple of the other
we've got teams specifically at the University of Pretoria working on they call it low resource languages on social platforms. Things like local, if you can think about Venda and P, they're not massively represented on social media platforms. And it makes it a challenge for social media moderators, which to be honest, none of the big Meta or Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, they haven't got a very big interest in having local moderators for each of our official languages. So because of that disinterest, it's kind of left up to moderators who don't understand the context, who would look at a specific phrase and then reckon, well, this doesn't conform to their usually US standards of hate speech. And there's actually, we had an instance here with the SA Human Rights Commission in South Africa had an issue with that. They were trying to get information from Twitter on a particular user who was perpetrating hate speech.
Yes.
And Twitter actually came back and said, sorry, they investigated, this doesn't conform to hate speech.
Yeah.
I've had that.
But this is a Chapter 9 organization set up by the South African Constitution, and some moderator in a US-based company is kind of making decisions on their behalf.
So,
it's a-
but I
it's a
mean,
big
now we've seen the case has been taken up by people based in Kenya, etc., working with the platforms demanding to be unionized, and they've shown us that these are merely sweatshops, the regionalized sweatshops. I don't think we can rely on the platforms to do that work. Is that correct? Any of you?
We've talked in the past about
Yes.
the lack of context that platforms have, because I think, a lot of them, although there is a small presence, basically their regional offices are often in Europe and the United States. And I think, Twitter is sort of European, North America, and North Africa, and all under one roof. And, there's very, very different contexts in which you're operating. But you also can't rely on machines who actually have to have human intervention. We came across a sort of slightly amusing start of research where, our data analytics guys who were on the call, we did an extraordinary job, so we need to give them a credit, came up with the phrase Ruto, and Ruto kept being flagged up as a K-pop band, the South Korean K-pop band. And so they had to adjust the search options. And that's where just relying on a machine and just relying on big platforms to have their automated moderation just doesn't work. You need to have people who
Could be up
understand.
to civil society to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to jump in there and throw a shout out in Media Monitoring Africa, but they've got I know they're in the room as well. They've got their Real 411 platform that basically works with these platforms, basically guiding them, giving them context, phrases and words that might mean something very derogatory in a South African context, might be glossed over by a US-based moderator looking at the same concept.
So that's again a great example, Alan.
And maybe just to add on this, and this is why we are advocating for independent research using social media data. Restrictions by Twitter, when it comes to the API, this actually plays into the strategy, because at the end of the day, for example, the research that was done during the Kenyan elections, it was made possible because of access to that data. Now, with thousands of dollars for you to actually get a simple API from the platform, it becomes a problem. And that's why we are advocating the civil society independent review of the environment, the information environment, really played a huge role in countering that particular influence practice in Kenya. But I think it needs to be rolled out everywhere. So these restrictions are actually playing against.
So to understand something, so Elon Musk closed the API as a way of making profit, commoditized. So it was open access, part of the public square before.
Yeah, it was. I mean, the API it's one of the reasons why the bulk, I think it's something like 95% of the research on disinformation and the way that it's spread is done on Twitter. The API was open, so anybody could access the data directly from Twitter. It was very, complete information. You had about, I think, 42 different fields from the date the post was made, the type of app that was used, whether it was an Android or an iPhone. There's lots of data on there that you can actually use to build up and kind of explain this phenomenon of disinformation. And with it being closed down, I'm saying closed down, but it's still accessible. But to put it into context, I mean, the amount of data we collected for this study would now cost, I think, probably about 5.4 million rand.
Really?
For that same amount of data.
And it was open access.
And it was open access, absolutely free up until now. And the big issue is that it's cut off, the researchers, the universities, the academics, the people who do this research for altruistic purposes. They're the ones suffering the most. The ones who are using it for political gain.
They've got the money.
They've got the money. They've got the resources to spend on something like this. But a researcher in a university who's doing something for his master's, the data are the ones that now need to find $42,000 a month to get the same
So I'm
level
just
of
going to
access.
go to some more
Sure,
questions or comments.
Can I quick small plug ISS, because we're hoping to replicate a similar study to this, looking at South Africa. And one of the things that we're having to do is to completely reevaluate costing, given the access to data that the divisions talked about. But that doesn't mean it's difficult.
must be done. So from Mo. Sound. So Siani Rananga, what can South Africa learn from the success of the Kenyan election coverage, I guess, and why can't we join hands with all interested organizations to unite for the sake of preventing the spread of misinformation? Absolutely. And then this one's interesting from Stanley. What of the hustlers versus the dynasties? I'd love you to explain that, the Hustler Intelligence Agency. Boniface Beatty, I would say tribal dynamics exist in Kenya due to weak political institutions and remain the key identity bedrock for political mobilization. And then they built onto this controlling messaging and narratives, and that becomes the space for contestation. So we've said that. Ian Barber, I'm curious to hear about the role of relevant legal frameworks in the country for prohibitions against false publication or false misinformation under Computer Misuse and Cybercrime Act used against those sharing the information online. So what was, Alan, what was the regulatory, was it at all able to rise to the challenge?
Yeah, so I think it wasn't perfect. So he mentioned about the Computer Misuse and Cybercrime Act. There were a couple of regulations that could be used to actually deter this. But I think the justification of like if you see Alan posting on social media, then number one, you're considering about freedom of expression, you need to have legal systems that can actually follow through with the law. That was quite a challenge when it comes to Kenya. I think right now there are a couple of people that have been taken to court just recently because of the protests that were happening in Kenya. Then and that also has brought a lot of conversations about freedom of expression vis-a-vis actually sharing disinformation and toxic content. So I think regulation is there. It needs a lot of work for it to actually work really well. I think we actually think South Africa has better regulation when it comes to this. Maybe Jean can.
Yes, yeah.
Actually, I think we don't. I think we've got 3 pieces of legislation that takes aim at false information. The first one is the IEC Act, which during election periods they're not allowed to spread false information around elections and voting and the counting of the votes. During COVID-19, we had those regulations around spreading false information around COVID specifically. And the third one is about the weather. The South African National Weather Bureau has got a specific provision that you're not allowed to send out false information about the weather. And I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people on the news weather channels that do that. But that's basically the 3 pieces of like regulatory frameworks that we've got to do that. Now, it doesn't mean we can't apply other frameworks, things like the Cybercrimes Act or things like the human rights framework is very well established. Those things can still form in there, whether you're uttering something on a letter to the editor or whether you're uttering it in a Facebook post. There's still that same level of expression happening. There's other laws that could be used to
But our colleague Adrian and others have tried to the police don't even have cell phones.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
Follow through.
So having our institutions and the organizations that are supposed to be safeguarding society at large, they're from the Hawks all the way through to the IEC, all of our various different Chapter 9 organizations, they need to be aware of this and how this works and kind of the mechanics behind it, technical platforms on which these things.
I don't think they can. They're going to need help to do.
I think they need help. I mean, it's a very technical field, and it's not a difficult field, but it's a technical field. You need to understand how it works. Otherwise, you do end up turning people away, telling them, sorry, we can't help. Go and talk to Facebook.
Yeah,
there are all ways of doing this.
They just
Well, if they go and report, where did the same crime happen? And you say cyberspace. So that's,
I'm glad the frameworks exist. I just want to bring Kyle. Kyle is one of the co-authors of the report. He is in Cape Town, I think. South Africa has its own influence merchants. Some do it for political purposes, others for commercial. Many mix both. So far, we are lucky enough that only some groups use their services and we don't have every political party fighting fire with fire in this way yet. That's interesting. And from Boniface again, in deeply divided societies, truth is often contested, and this is where misinformation and disinformation becomes instrumentalized to create convenient facts and replayed to create divide and conquer narratives on the masses by political elites to capture state power. Correct?
You had a question about the Hostile Nation Intelligence Bureau, and I think it's worth just really quickly testing, and I'd really like to do is kind of double act with my colleagues on this. But one of the narratives that came out during the election was the deep state narrative, which to put plainly is a conspiratorial narrative that was used quite effectively by the Ruto's side. And attached to this, with this rather bizarre thing called the Hostile Nation Intelligence Bureau, which was effectively a device where online users were encouraged to call out alleged transgressions by the other side, and the other side was presumably rather doing as a side, whether it be allegations that they were planning to storm the political place where the count was happening, or various other types of protests that were going on. And when we questioned the actors about this, why do you have to use this bizarre? Because it effectively was undermining the rule of law, and it was undermining the institutions that are supposed to be seeking and looking and investigating wrongdoing, not the police. It was a device that we used. No one really knew that it was very serious. It was a device that we were using to be able to be present, be relative online, for the same reason I said before, we couldn't get access to advertising revenue in mainstream media. So we created this device called the Hostile Nation Intelligence Bureau based on this deep state narrative. The danger with that is two things. One, it encourages digital vigilantism, which is basically real world playing out of vigilantism if someone is called out online without, judge, jury, and execution all in the same voice of the Hostile Nation Intelligence Bureau. But at the extreme, there is the potential for it to provide a pretext, a false flag event for a much more authoritarian style of government in Kenya further down. And I think that's something that a lot of social scientists have been watching very, very carefully. So although, one can laugh at this Hostile Nation Intelligence Bureau, it's a fairly normal name, continuing, by the way, even though the side that was using it most effectively are now the deep state themselves. It is a device to effectively undermine democratic state institutions to be able to investigate wrongdoing or to make allegations which may well be effective.
So I'd like to, how many minutes do we have left? Like, 20, okay. Tandy and then Lisa.
Okay, great. I'm Tanya Smith from Media Monitoring Africa. Jean's already mentioned Real 4-on-1, but my question is actually around what any comment from the panel around where we see Twitter now versus what Twitter was during this research and during our previous elections, and where we see Twitter going in the lead up to our elections next year, given the fact that Elon has sort of opened it up so broadly to almost I would even call it at sometimes encouraging disinformation and hate speech, given his provocative tweets at times, and what we've just seen his comments around the so-called genocide and so forth. He feels the need to comment on that. So where do we see Twitter in this space? And also, do we see TikTok as a platform coming up in this space? I know that TikTok has very relaxed or no kind of regulations around political advertising and that sort of thing on the platform. So it's a whole gray area, and I don't think we've seen TikTok playing a role very much in previous elections. So how do we see that coming up in our next election?
Thank you. Lisa,
Thank you.
your
Yes.
question.
Thanks for a very interesting discussion. I'm just wondering, I mean, I understand it's impossible to find out who's financing what, but it sounds a bit like a fight between good and evil. So the good people, the monitoring, people who are trying to regulate all of this, are these governments, civil society, who's financing the good side? That's why. That's my first question. The other one, Pharaoh, is also South Africa's elections. What are we talking about? What is the risk here? Apart from political parties, now I understand, trying to amplify and, this message. Russia, what's the elephant in the room? What are we talking about as the biggest risk that these platforms hold for, or the influence hold for?
Doesn't it mean that money can buy elections? Which I guess is how it's always been done. But I think this question's right.
Who's money? I think that's a question.
Yeah, I think from the other side, it's clear that the kind of the strategy from the new Twitter, or Twitter 2.0, as Elon likes to call it, is
X. We should be calling
or
it
X, there we go.
actually.
So, or that's what formerly known as Twitter. I mean, the way that it's structured now is for engagement. Even like, for example, the Twitter Blue or the X Blue or X Premium as it's called now, it sounds really dodgy. So even that is geared towards getting your replies, your responses from people who purchase that up, in the reply section. It's built around engagement. The people who are paid, and there was a slew of payments that he made relatively recently, handpicked, mind you, but he's still paid out. All of those payments were based off the amount of engagement that they got underneath their posts. So the idea isn't, it's not about getting, an equal amount of narratives out there or making sure that all voices are heard. It's not the same town square that we knew. This is now, a handful of people who are willing to pay for the platform. Their views get amplified. And you can often see it any type of post where there's anything related to science, any type of discovery. The first couple of responses you see to that is always people with these blue check marks. And I'm going to be perfectly frank, they come with the dumbest takes on that. And it's a kind of a consequence. These are people who are willing to pay for engagement because they don't get engagement otherwise. And that's because the kind of things that they're saying aren't worth engaging on. But it's kind of being thrust at it. But the problem is it's actually drowning out good conversations because you need to scroll further down to find, the real scientists chiming in, the people who aren't willing to pay for the engagement because they get it anyway based on the content that they get. On your point about kind of what the elephant in the room is and what the biggest risk is, I think if we learned anything from the whole Bell Pottages and the Gupta bot saga was that we've got a lot of division in South Africa that's easy to exploit. Whether it's based off of race, whether it's based off of economic disparities, even if it's based off this supposed white genocide that's going on, all of those things are used as levers to drive those wedges in society. And the consequence of that is that there's multiple kind of repercussions for that. But the biggest thing for me is that it undermines all of these democratic norms and institutions that we've built up. Because in order to do that, you need to delegitimize the media. You need to delegitimize, the Human Rights Commission and the IEC and all of these, to kind of protect all of these institutions that are set up to safeguard our democracy. They need to be undermined in order for these narratives to take root and kind of get their sway. Another thing as well is that it kind of robs us of having earnest and frank conversations with each other because these narratives are weaponized. And the white monopoly capital is a very good example of that. Because it was used so extensively during the Bell Pottages campaign, if you mention the word now, it immediately gets shot down as, no, that's something that Bell Pottages created. We don't need to have a conversation about white monopoly capital. And in actual fact, there is a conversation about the disparity of wealth in South Africa along racial lines. But you can't have that conversation because when white monopoly capital gets mentioned, it's suddenly a Bell Pottages creation. It's not something real, intangible. So we've actually been robbed of having that conversation as a country with each other because of that. So for me, those are probably the big three kind of big risks. I think tangential to that is things like having foreign states kind of step in. If they can pay the right people to get the right narratives across, that it's basically influencing our local policy based off of what they're willing to pay. In multinationals, after specific economic policies is another risk that step in during those election periods. And all of these, regardless of who's pushing it, the most effective lever that they can use are these things that kind of undermine our local cohesion, as it were.
Thank you. Do you want to take up Liesel's important question?
Yeah, I think this idea of sort of foreign influence and being able to stir the pot, because that's effectively what we do. And influence can be very subtle. It can be using proxies to be able to amplify a particular narrative. And so, the case that I mentioned, who was a product influencer, had said to us he'd been approached by foreign actors, and on this occasion he'd chosen not to go. Maybe the colour of money wasn't strong, wasn't right enough. But I didn't get any sense of conviction from him that he would be sort of averse to working for other external actors. No one's asked us about Team George. I just want to quickly say Team George was the story that was running about an Israeli-led operation, pretty insignificant, to be honest, in terms of when we looked at their presence and their ability to stir the pot. So I think you also have to be aware of external actors claiming that they have influence, when actually that they may not, but they may have sought some time and capital simply by making that claim. But as I think, one of the biggest dangers is actually also us as the media, and consider myself as having one foot in this media, of being used inadvertently, not necessarily just as a useful idiot, but one of the things that we did observe in Kenya, and this is where I think the media environment is different in South Africa, of effectively using your day job as a legitimate legacy newsroom operator, and the evening using your influence to be able to support a particular campaign. And I think we did observe that. We did see some people who effectively moonlighting. Kenyan journalists don't get paid very much, and so this is a warning to people who are looking at how the media is actually financed and restructuring.
So in the day you're a journalist, down by the rules of
an influence. Yeah, we can.
And in the evening
you might be pushing for a particular political narrative using your followers. So I left the BBC with 28,000 followers. You know what? I missed a trick. I really missed a trick, because we realized that, and it wouldn't even occur to me to do this. Now, I had the same conversation with South African journalists, and the journalistic fraternity here, if you like, the journalistic community here is very tight. The thought of doing that is so abhorrent and such a professional violation that perhaps we wouldn't have such a risk here, and because of a different media environment. But I think, yeah, absolutely. But I think, you can't completely discount that risk. So I think if there are any external actors, and I'm going to say, I don't think it is just Russia. We're talking about the elephant in the room, but I don't think it is just Russia. I think there are lots of actors in the space. We came into this looking actor agnostic, but we saw small footprints from other regional players who were interested in being able to leverage the Kenyan election for their own ends, whether it was to promote the rights of the Tigrayan community in Ethiopia, or whether it was Ugandans or Nigerians. There are different actors who all have an interest in this. And I think, we certainly have a greater vulnerability, I think, in South Africa with the election next year, given the historic ties and the potential to be able to meddle the pot, stir the pot. But I think we need to be careful about assuming it's only coming from one side.
Okay. And then I want to ask you, so I've noticed that after the coup in Niger and others, social media is used a lot to legitimize that. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, so I think we've actually been looking, so in one of the other projects that we do, we've been looking at how foreign influence is kind of being seeded in, I think, about 24 African countries, right? Yeah. So, and one of the things is that for the Niger coup, so there've been, coups in the Sahel region, quite a number of them. There was a difference in this particular one. And as you say, the legitimization of this particular coup, really, you couldn't pick up a lot of conversations before the coup that would indicate, foreign influence or interference. But then immediately, and I will give you a context. So we were looking at different actors. Russia became one of the key conversations because we were looking at, for example, the mention of the US, of France, of Britain, of Turkey and Russia and China. in social media conversations in relation to Niger. And between our analysis was like between January and July, there were like about 13,000 tweets that mentioned, any context, Russia and Niger. But the 5 days after the coup, from 26th of July to 31st of July, we had about 246,000. So you can see like the conversation was kind of an immediate spike. And this is in comparison to when you look at Burkina Faso and you look at the other regions, the conversation was kind of, building up. And I think we did a piece with Tessa where we could see that pro-Russian sentiment growing, from the early days, probably months before the coup, which was the different thing when it comes to Niger.
So I do want to touch on Russia, South African influence of just a little, and I hear your caution that let's not create a single bogeyman, bogey person. But what I have noticed is anytime I tweet anything that's shows up what's happening in Ukraine, I get a local sock puppet army coming down on you like a ton of rain. What's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Is it just organic support for Russia, historical, or is
yeah,
it
I think
something
the
else
South
at
African
play?
context is interesting because you don't want to discount legitimate and organic support. You will find people that are supporting Russia. They support the Ukraine. They've got their reasons. I might think they're wrong, and most people might think they're wrong, but they're allowed to have those thoughts and allowed to think and even say those things.
But they're not those people.
But-
They're not people who benefited from struggle links with Russia. They're
Exactly,
young,
the young
I don't
people.
even know them.
So it's always, my question is always like, you need to try and determine, well, how authentic is that comment? Is it as if it's somebody with a legitimate and an authentic support with them? I mean, they're allowed to say that. But the problem becomes when you have a sock puppet, somebody that set up an account that's doing this from, they might be sitting at some foreign ministry somewhere sending out these things. And I mean, as Scott said, we don't want to, kind of pinpoint Russia and has this big bogeyman and you kind of miss all of the other actors. But the unfortunate thing is they are well set up. They've done this before. They've got the infrastructure. They've got the technical expertise and the know-how to pull off these type of campaigns and do it effectively. The big concern for me in the coming elections is that there is a vested interest for them. With the ANC, they've got a lot of issues and a lot of problems with the coming elections. And they've got a vested interest to keep them in place. So in my mind, this would be a perfect kind of combination of having a foreign state who've got friends locally in South Africa that they want to keep in power, where at the same time you've got a local political party that's kind of on the back foot, and they are likely to ask their friends to try and assist them. So for me, that's a big concern with the coming elections, is having this combination of expertise on the one hand and the type of light desperation on the other end, the combination of those two during the elections. As Alan mentioned about in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso, there, for example, there's a lot of opportunism on the part of Russia when it comes to these.
Is it Wagner or is it the Russian state, or are those indivisible?
They're kind of indivisible. I mean, they've kind of over the years set themselves up as presumably separate, but in actual fact, there's a lot of conflation and financing running across the. You could see them as an extension of the Russian state, the one that's got that level of deniability attached to it.
And then has our continent got sufficient basically digital armies of the good to counter that massive wave which we see coming at us now in the study of 24 countries?
I would say not, because and the reason is because as we mentioned earlier, how lucrative it is, right? A lot of the work that the Force for Good does is probably funded in one way or another.
I think
there isn't a lot of
was asking about,
and so like an example is because for Kenya the risk was more conflict, post-election violence related, and the reason we were looking specifically at hate speech was because so our work was funded by the United Nations, the Peace and Development, and also the Office of Human Rights, or HCHR. And one of the things that we were looking at was, the probability that hate speech will then lead to violence, and then that goes against some of the mandates that they have in the country. So there is, some ways, there is some interest in terms of global organizations, development organizations, especially those that try to empower media and the independence and trust in the media to actually fund the work to do this. But I think, it's never enough. I think the other side has a lot of resources available.
Thank you. So let's just wrap up. We've got 5 minutes. If we to say what shall South Africa and other countries coming with elections soon, what can we learn from this excellent report, Karen?
That speed is king. That
Speed is king.
ultimately, speed is king. And as we, this is now a year on since the elections, we've got all new tools that are coming in that actually influence operations are here to stay. That actually to be able that one of the biggest challenges that we've learned from Kenya is that you've got to be able to identify them really, really quickly, but also to be able to respond quickly. So I think there's a certain degree of knowledge building that's needed. And in the 2 months' time, it may be too late. We need to start educating people now. And that includes our leaders, that includes our ministers, that includes the communicators in the South African government, who are really, I can tell you there is a hunger to be able to learn about this kind of stuff. But their superiors, their principals, need to give them the tools to be able to learn how to respond and learn how to have a certain amount of autonomy to be able to, I don't mean necessarily mean fire with fire, but at least be aware of the potential threat. So I think what Kenya's done is it's shown that there is an information ecosystem which is incredibly active, which can be exported very, very easily. I'm not saying that they're necessarily Kenyan actors that would be hired by external forces to be able to wreak havoc in South Africa. We have our own influencers. We looked at July 2021. We saw influencers during the upheaval and the unrest here being used allegedly by foreign actors as well. So I think, the number one thing is that, the next election is like Kenya is going to be fought on tech. Speed is going to be king. Speed both in terms of identifying types of influence, and it's not just disinformation, it is influence. It's not just the funny picture of a politician who with a twist. It is actually the networking. So I think, we need to develop that sense of urgency that I think Kenya has shown us much faster.
I think for me, just building on, speed is king, and the risk here is that AI is making it even faster. So you've seen instances in the DRC where videos are being produced by M23 militia groups. In Burkina Faso, AI being used to generate content. With less than $30, you can actually produce a 10-minute convincing news reporting about a situation using AI, and it will then, be able to be transferred a lot. So I think speed is king, and if we can be able now to figure out ways of beating that is one of the things we are advocating for. And I think my final point is just learning from the Kenyan elections. So one thing we realized after the completion of the elections is that there were so many actors looking to solve this problem. And so UNESCO actually then put together a lot of organizations in Kenya that were working in this space to form a coalition. Because now we realized we are actually just working in silos, like, this person is doing the same thing that the other person is doing. So ahead of the next election, ahead of it, continuously from today going forward, we have like a coalition. It's called the Coalition for Content Moderation and Freedom of Expression. And this is kind of all organizations in Kenya that work together to do this. I would say earlier on in South Africa, that should be something that they should consider to be formed, and they will kind of act like jigsaw puzzles, where I have the capacity, where you have the capacity, you kind of fit it in order to make this a success.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sean, last.
Yeah, Ellen actually was making exactly the point I wanted to make.
Yeah.
We've got expertise in some of the NGOs. We've got organizations and institutions that are keen and know this is a problem. But finding them and having them speak to each other, I think is critical. We've got some time with elections. I think that's kind of a saving grace that we've got. The election, sorry, Alan, your election's already done, but we can learn from that and implement something like
so
this.
much time.
Have like these organizations just speaking with each other, having the same conversation, knowing who's looking at what, who can bring which skills and funding and platforms and platforms, have those type of conversations within the NGOs firstly, but then also from, government side, the institutions that are tasked with upholding democracies. This is the type of thing they can get
That's your
involved with.
IC, your HRC.
Yes, the Chapter 9 institutions, the ones that you would want to capacitate to deal with these things in a way that upholds their own mandate in terms of the Constitution. So that combination, I think, would be, in my approach, is having the technical expertise from CSOs, combine that with the mandate from government, and then have that as a way to have that.
Thank you for an excellent report. Thank you to everyone who joined us online, and to all of you who joined us here. Thank you so much. You could join me